欢迎大家来到我们今天的这个 BRI 公益大讲堂大家晚上好。那我呢先大概介绍一下我们今天的这个讲座，我们的这个BRI 公益大讲堂的这个背景哈。那我们这个大讲堂呢是由 BRI 侨路基金会主办的哈。那我们这个侨路基金会呢是在旧金山湾区成立的一个华人的非营利组织。主要的目的是为了为这个华人社区服务，然后呢也培养我们下一代的这个华人领袖哈。那在去年的时候呢，这个 pandemic 开始的时候，那侨路基金会呢联合了几十家在湾区的华人其他的组织哈，然后一起来筹款捐赠 PPE 给疫区的医院、护理机构、警察局等等哈，一线的这个护理人员和服务人员哈。那另外呢，我们也是在线上举办各种公益讲座，为大家提供疫情的知识包括其他的大家感兴趣的话题哈，能够让大家能够顺利的度过这个疫情。那大家知道哈，昨天上是发生了一件很不幸的事情哈。那这个在 Atlanta 那边呢是有一个歹徒哈袭击了这个华人，就是亚裔的这个商业机构哈。然后呢有8位哈，实际上是有6位的亚裔被枪杀这是一个非常悲痛的事情。那像今天早上呢，我又听到说，在这个旧金山有一位70岁的老奶奶也是受到袭击哈。最近这个针对亚裔的这个仇恨犯罪上是非常的显著的提升哈。所以呢，我们再次也提醒大家，就说要注意安全。那另外一个呢，我们也是希望就是说我们的华人社区哈，包括亚裔社区能够团结起来，来制止这个针对亚裔的仇恨犯罪。那我们在开始我们讲座之前，我先预告一下，实际上是跟这个亚裔的仇恨犯罪相关的。我们有一个接下来的一个讲座哈，是下个星期3，是面对种族歧视，亚裔该如何应对哈？是我们请了一个比较有名的陈绍明律师来给我们讲那这个时间呢是3月24号晚上7点，那欢迎大家来关注哈。好，那接下来呢，我们就有请我们今天的主持哈，我们的真的是华二代哈 ，Rina 徐来介绍我们今天的主讲嘉宾
Rina。Hello, my name is Rina. I'm going to start off with an introduction to BRI. So BRI, or Bridge Road International Organization, is a nonprofit youth group that was founded in March of 2020. Our mission is to give young students a chance to use their talents, abilities, and leadership skills to serve local communities. We are a team of around 130 high schoolers who serve more than 350 students through offering a variety of online classes and special needs one-to-one tutoring. We also participate in many community service events. Other than hosting online classes, we also participated in the COVID-19 relief by donating to different relief centers and participating in service opportunities. We also hold many seminars on a wide range of topics, including college talks, holiday concerts, and weekend special interest topics. So now introducing our respected speaker, Raymond Douglas Chong, or Zhang Weiming, is a senior roadway manager with the Oregon Department of Transportation at Portland in Oregon. He is responsible for preliminary engineering of transportation improvement projects in Portland metro region. Born and raised in Los Angeles, Raymond is 6th-generation Chinese American with family roots in America extending back to California Gold Rush, Transcontinental Railroad, Boston Chinatown, Cambridge Imperial Restaurant, and Kublai Khan Theater Restaurant. As president of Generations, LLC, in the creative realm, Raymond writes stories, pens poems, composes lyrics, and makes films. His recent works include a book, Amour Mystique Poetry, An Intimate Passion in Sultry Fire, a book, Chop Suey and Sushi, From Sea to Shining Sea, a poem, Canto Cutie, an album, Village of Dragon Hill, A Mystical Journey in Passion, and a film, My Odyssey Between Two Worlds. He has written journal articles on the Chinese American experiences for Chinese Historical Society of America and Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. He is also staff writer for ASAM News, an Asian American internet newspaper.
Thank you, Arena. I appreciate the introduction. And I'm in Texas right now, so the southern thing. Howdy, you all. So I'm pleased to present The American Dream, the Zhang Clan Odyssey on Go Mountain. And I have my program. I want to share with you all The American Dream, the Zhang Clan Odyssey on Go Mountain. Raymond Douglas Chong. And it's a story extending back to 1849, 172 years of American and Chinese history. My story is your story. Okay, and that's me, Raymond Douglas Chong, Zhang Weiming. And my roots extends back to China many generations to a place called Kaiping in Jiangmen in Guangdong in China. What is the American dream? Everybody has different interpretations depending on their circumstances. But the American dream is that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to ability or achievement. That is the definition of the American dream in 1931. And this holds true even now, 90 years later in 2021. My roots not just extends one generation, two generations, extends back to the Hongdi, the Yulong Emperor, 158 generations from my son back to Hongdi, Yulong Emperor, to the time of the year 2710 BC. And that is to your right, my family Jopu, or family tree. And from my roots, I know my ancestors who live across China over time. They were honorable civil servants, village leaders, and peacemakers. And from my forefathers, 5 generations were sojourners to America, starting with my father, going back to my great-great-grandfather. And I have a website called the Zhang Clan Odyssey with my China roots. And it describes the history of my family since around 500 AD China to my respective forefathers through the chronicles, and my ancestral line over time from 500 AD moving forward to now, to this very moment in 2021. My roots are from Kaiping, in Sayup, the 4 counties. We're among the 4 counties in Guangdong, near Canton, near Hong Kong, near Macau. Those is the place of my roots in Kaiping, in the Tanjing, in the Jeung, in the Pearl River Delta of Guangdong. And my roots extends back to Yulong, the village of Dragon Hill, a village that has been around since 1506 AD. And to the right is the UNESCO World Heritage landmark, the Dai Lo, Castle in the Sky. That is where my roots are. My my ancestral land of Kaiping in Guangdong. And this is the moment when they were greeting me when I arrived at the village. To the left is the elders, the troop, meeting me, greeting me in front of the village. To the right is the ancestral hall of my village in Yolongong. And this story is about my 7 generations on Gold Mountain, starting with Cheun and Jeung with the California Gold Rush. Second generation, Bein Yiu Chung, the Transcontinental Railroad worker. Generation 3, Lun Chung, the gambling and opium merchant. Generation 4, Moi Chung, my grandfather, the Chop Suey owner. Generation 5, Gim Suey Chong, my father, the nightclub owner. Generation 6, myself and my brother, my baby brother. And generation 7, my number 1 son, Kinji Kyle Chong. So this is the story of the 7 generations here in America, Gold Mountain, or in Cantonese, Gim Suey. And my history extends in America since 1849 to now. And it has crossed through the significant events in America, but also in China, in 2 separate parallel worlds. This is a huge tapestry of a long history of my family, not just in America, but in China, our homeland. Generation 1, Cheun and Jeung, and this is the name in Cantonese in the old way in the romanization of the names, Cheun and Jeung. Jeung was the spelling of the name by an immigration official at that time. So generation 1 was the time in China, 1839 to 1849, I correct. 1839 to 1849 was the beginning of the century of humiliation for China by the European powers, by the Empire of Japan and America. That was the beginning of the terrible century for China, the century of humiliation. And what happened in 1848 was the discovery of gold at the Sutter's Mill near Sacramento. And there was a mad rush to discover gold, mine for gold, to rush from all parts of the world, from Europe, Eastern America, Latin America, and in China, to go to San Francisco, the port of San Francisco, the first city. And that was the start of the California Gold Rush. And the gold fields were along Sacramento, from the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, along the American River, the further river, and further north, up through the Sacramento River. These were the lucrative gold fields that were picked off from the rivers, from the surface of the land, from 1848 to 1855. These were the gold fields of California at that time. And this is a picture of a typical Chinese gold miner in 1852. And even then, the American whites had a negative impression of the Chinese. In this picture, they say the heathen Chinese, that were godless people, exotic people. We were heathens even back then in 1852. Back in 1849, we were already stigmatized, discriminated already back 172 years ago. So my great-grandfather was a gold miner. And among the Chinese gold miners were other people from Europe, Eastern America, Latin America, and other parts of China, in particular from Sayep to come to Gold Mountain, Gamsung, the land of gold, the land of richness. And there's a mixture of competition between the whites. It was a matter of survival at that time. So my great-great-great-grandfather, Cheun mined for gold at that time for a few years, but he went back to the village. Generation 2, Bein Yiu Chung. And you might notice the surname has changed because American whites, the immigration officials, could not properly write our names in English. It was always some kind of change in the spelling of our surname. So in this case, it was Chung at that time. So this is my great-great-grandfather, Bein Yiu Chung, generation 2. And at that time in China, from 1855, 1867, China was under chaos, turmoil. And in the region of Guangdong in that particular time was a lot of clan wars between the Punta and Hakka. The people were fighting for the land, for survival. And this lasted from 1855 to 1867. And this was a circumstance when my great-great-grandfather lived, growing up in Yulongong, in the village in Kaiping. So he arrived at the port of San Francisco on a China clipper ships. Arrived, and this is a picture of what San Francisco looked like in 1865. He came here with his cousin at that time. Why? Not for gold, not for mining, but to be part of a massive engineering achievement, the first Transcontinental Railroad from 1865 to 1869. The first Transcontinental Railroad, or otherwise known as the Iron Road. And this is a map showing the Transcontinental Railroad, the red, the initial line from San Francisco to Sacramento. From Sacramento in blue all across to Promontory Summit, from California to Nevada to Utah, 950 miles of building the railroad. From the west, from the east was from Omaha, Nebraska, and that is from the Pacific, the Union Pacific Railroad Company, across Nebraska to Wyoming, again to Promontory Summit in Utah. That was the meeting point of the two railroads at that time. So Central Pacific to the left, from the west, from the east, the Union Pacific Railroad. And for the Chinese railroad workers, otherwise known as the Army of Canton, there were 12,000 Chinese who went from Sacramento, 40 feet elevation, up to Donner Summit, elevation 7,000 feet, 90 miles, a steady slope across, beyond to Reno, to the Great Basin, across the desert to Promontory Summit. This is the plan, the profile, a rugged terrain that they had to endure and overcome. This is the Transcontinental Railroad. This is what the engineering that they had to face. And what they do, there were many achievements by the Chinese railroad workers. Here in Blummer Cut, they had to dig 800 feet long, almost 75 deep, a clay, rocky land about 50 miles east of Sacramento. That took many months of cracking the boomer cut to cut through that clay rocks. Cape Horn, that is along the bluff near the Sierra Nevada, cutting across. And below that was the American River, 1,200 feet below them. They had to be very careful in cutting a wedge in order to build the railroad line. That was Cape Horn. Another achievement was to build Dutch Flat, a 50-mile of a wagon road to provide the logistics, the supplies, for example, the ties, the wood, the food, things of that nature, to support the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad through the Central Pacific Railroad. But the biggest achievement was Summit Tunnel. Roughly 15 tunnels, roughly 6,300 feet of digging, blowing with explosive, dynamite, things of that nature, solid rock, 15 tunnels to get through the Summit Tunnel for the breakthrough into the Great Basin to the desert of Nevada and Utah, the Summit Tunnel. And from the Great Basin, the Chinese, my great-great-grandfather, extended the line across the desert. And imagine, little water, the native Indians, 120-degree temperature to work in these conditions, 120 degrees across the Great Basin to Promontory Summit. But when they got there, it was May 10th, 1869. 2 years left was the Central Pacific Railroad. To the right was the Union Pacific Railroad. And this was the day of the Golden Spike, a momentous achievement. And when they telegraphed to the rest of America, the statement was D-O-N-E, done. But you see in this picture, there were 12,000 Chinese rail workers. But in this picture, none were recognized. None were honored at that time. It was, in the view, it was done by the American whites at that time in 1869. Fast forward 150 years later, at the very same spot, May 10th, 2019, the descendants of the Chinese American rail workers were there, were represented. We represent their spirit, their souls, their sweat across the American West. And this was a picture taken to commemorate 150 years later. And this is right here, me, Zhang Weiming. I was there on May 10th, 2019. And this picture, this awesome photo, was taken by a phenomenal photographer named Corky Lee. From there, you think the Chinese would be respected with courtesy, with respect. No, this was the era of the anti-Chinese hysteria. We were the scapegoat, the easy prey, because there were very few of us Chinese. We were considered exotic, evil. We were a danger to the American woman. We were defenseless against the mobs, whether it was right or wrong. We were victims, even back then, 172 years ago. So this is not a new phenomenon. It has happened in the course of American history. We are a threat. The yellow pearl, P-E-R-I-A-L, a threat to the dominant American society in America. And here's a slogan, the famous slogan, the Chinese must go. How do you feel about that? Being shouted, you go back home. No, we say the Chinese must go. That was the cry of the racist American at that time. And the consequence, there were harassment, taunting, physical assaults. But then there were massive criminal incidents. The Los Angeles Massacre in 1871. My hometown, Los Angeles, where 17 Chinese in a mob action were hung on the trees, shot, mutilated, destroyed. And none of the perpetrators were in a trial, nor were they jailed or convicted of those 17 murders in 1871. Another aspect of the American experience is the laws against the Chinese, whether it's at the federal level, state level, local level. In 1875, Congress passed the Page Act that prohibited the entry to America of Chinese women. It was basically an act of ethnic cleansing to depopulate the Chinese community here in America. And the consequence was a bachelor society where it created in Chinatown, in communities, virtually for every Chinese woman, there were maybe up to 14 Chinese men. So it created a lot of situations that affected the mindset for the Chinese men at that time, in the late 19th century through the 20th century, the bachelor society. Then, during the course of that, Congress in 1882 passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that was to tie in the regulation, the immigration, to build that wall. This was the first legal wall against a racial class, the Chinese. And it specifically prohibited the immigration of more Chinese laborers. Again, we were the scapegoat for all the ills of what was happening in America at that time, the economic depression, the unemployment. There were so few of us, so we were easy prey, scapegoat for the American whites. So this was the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And from course of other history in the American West, in 1885, the Rock Springs Massacre. And that was a time in Wyoming where there was a coal mine and there was Chinese miners at the time. And it created a lot of tension with the European American miners because Chinese were accepting lower wages. And the result was a mob action in 1885 where 28 Chinese miners were slaughtered by a white mob, and none were jailed or convicted of the crime. 28 Chinese miners were killed. Later on, at Hell's Canyon in Oregon, along the Snake River, and there were a bunch of Chinese miners looking for gold. 34 of them were massacred, shot, knife, scalp, whatever, by 7 white horse thieves. They were never convicted, never accountable for their crime. 34 Chinese were killed in 1887 at Hills Canyon in Oregon. Generation 3, Lun Chung, my great-grandfather. And this is a picture of him in 1923. To the left is him. To the right, a young boy, that is my father in 1923. This is the story of Lun Chung, my great-grandfather. And this was a time when he arrived here in Gumsum, America. This was the era of the Empress Dowager, Cheun. She was the dominant influencer, in a way, the mistress of China that affected China at that time, the Imperial China. And that was the world of China at that time. And that was a time when my great-grandfather arrived in Gold Mountain in America. He arrived to a place called Boston Chinatown from 1891 to 1976. And this was in Boston Chinatown, a community of the center of New England. This is the heart of the Chinese community, was in Boston Chinatown. And the reason why he had Chinatown was because the whites segregated the Chinese in these ghettos known as Chinatown, because the Chinese could not own property, they could not rent. They were forced to be in these enclaves called Chinatown. And that was where Lun Chung, my great-grandfather, lived and worked. But what did he do living in Boston Chinatown at that time for 35 years? And at that time, there's the tradition to respect spring festivals, autumn festival. These was the life that they reflect back the homeland of China to America. Spring festival, autumn festival. They respect our traditions from China. And through this closure, my great-grandfather was a successful merchant. He was an entrepreneur. He was successful in gambling. That was a vice that was very popular at that time. Another venture he got into was opium at that time. So you can say my Lun Chung was an entrepreneur in the realm of gambling, opium. It was very lucrative for him to be a merchant at that time in Boston Chinatown. But in Chinatown, there were rivalries between gangs, the Oolong Tong, the dominant gangs or tongs of the East. And there was the Hipson Tong, the dominant gangs from the West, from San Francisco. And there were hatchet men, tong men, high binders at that time. They were gangsters in that time in Chinatown, all across America, from San Francisco, all across to New York City. And in 1907, the Chinese were killed in a place called Oxford Place. These three men were part of the Oolong Tong. They were killed by gangsters from the Hipson Tong. And they were massacred in 1907 at a place called Oxford Place in Boston Chinatown, near where my great-grandfather had his gambling parlor and opium den. Generation 4, Moi Chung, my grandfather. He arrived in 1912 to America And this was the time of the founding of the Republic of China in 1912, from the Imperial China to the Republic of China in Sun Yat-sen. It was the new China, the dawn of a new China in 1912. And that was the time when my grandfather, Moi Chung, left the village of Guangdong in 1912. And he arrived in San Francisco Harbor on June 17th, 1912, aboard the SS Mongolia, entering the port of San Francisco in 1912. And the reason why I know about that, I have his Chinese immigration file, the records of his travel from Wollongong to Hong Kong to San Francisco in 1912. And by then, American had their first formal immigration station on the West Coast, known as Angel Island. And this was from 1910 to 1940, where the federal immigration official processed the Chinese, the Asians, Russian, Jews. And this was here where my grandfather, Moi Chung, was processed at that time. He came here in 1912 on a student visa. And he arrived in San Francisco Chinatown in 1912 and lived from 1912 to 1917. It was a time of rebuilding after the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. So things were being built, being created, a new Chinatown that had a very focused Oriental architecture to draw tourists into Chinatown for business. And he lived in a place called Chong Sing Company, a dry goods store at 658 Grant Avenue in San Francisco. And what you see is a clip of a video made in 1912. And you see the number 658. That is the Chong Sing Company, where Moi Chung lived and worked, and eventually was the owner of that particular store from 1912 to 1917. From there, he left for the east to Cambridge, Central Square, to Boston Chinatown from 1917 to 1921, to a place to experience Chop Suey. Chop Suey is a variation of Cantonese dishes that fits the American taste. Chop Suey, a very popular cuisine for Americans in the 20th century. Chop Suey. So what he did, he owned part of a restaurant called the Royal Restaurant from 1919 to 1921 in Boston Chinatown, a place on 16 Harrison Avenue on one side. On the other side is Oxford Place, the same place where there was that massacre of the Long Tong gangsters. So what I'm showing you is what it was doing was a chop suey. There was a Chinese food, but also they had to serve American food to cater to the market. They have both ways, not just Chinese, but American dishes. And they also had entertainment at that time at the Royal Restaurant in Boston Chinatown on Harrison and Oxford Place from 1919 to 1921. Then eventually, from 1923 to 1936, he was we call the majority owner of the Imperial Restaurant in Central Square, in the heart of Cambridge, between Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And this place was kind of a high-end. It was on the second floor of this particular historic building with a sign in front near Central Square saying Chop Suey, the Imperial Restaurant. And this catered specifically to the white American clientele, white linen tables. It was very suited well for the American palate. So that was his restaurant from 1923 to 1936. Eventually, he had to move on because of the Great Depression to move to a place called back to Los Angeles on the West Coast, south of San Francisco, called a place called Little Tokyo, Niimachi, on Japantown, an enclave for roughly 20,000 Japanese, Nisei. And this is where he lived, in Little Tokyo, on East 2nd Street from 1936 to 1943, near Los Angeles City Hall. This was his world where he lived and worked in Little Tokyo for those 7 years. And when he arrived, he had a lot of ties with the family. One of his cousins had a Chop Suey cafe called the Yak Kong Lo Chop Suey Cafe on 339 and a half East 2nd Street in the heart of Little Tokyo. And the clientele were mostly Nikkei, Japanese Americans, Issei, immigrants from Japan. This is where he worked from 1936 onward. And then, of course, of his life, he experienced grief. He was separated from my grandmother. He left the village Lungo after he married my grandmother in 1921. And my father was born. Because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, it was difficult for him to bring my grandmother, his wife. And it was a matter of a long lost love. They were separated from 1923 to 1966. Imagine he left a young mother with my father. Fast forward 43 years later, in 1966, on February 14th, at Los Angeles International Airport, an elderly woman met my grandfather. And this is a poem of a long lost love that I wrote for them, for my long lost lover. Below a pearly moon, amid an edgy sleep, teary roars of a thunderstorm awaken me. My dreamy mind arouses for a creamy blossom of Kaiping. My dragon heart achingly weeps. Why can we not share our lives? Why may I not feel your lust? Why are you so far away from me across a Pacific Sea? While my lonely dusts are so long, I would never adore another. I would never declare farewell to you. I will save myself for my long lost lover. So this is a poem in my imagination of my grandfather living in America, waiting for my grandmother for 43 years later, from 1923 to 1966, his long lost lover. Generation 5, Gim Suey Chong, or Young Bongshan in Mandarin, my father, our quiet man. And this is a picture of him around 1943. And this is to the left is the house where he was born in Yonglong, the 9th house on the 6th alley on December 26, 1922. And to your right is the picture, the one wearing the little bin. To the left is my father in 1923 with his cousin. And this is his birthplace. This is his story. At that time, when he left from Yonglong to go mountain, Gamsam, the Japanese Imperial Army was invading Manchuria in 1931 to 1932. It was the slow beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. This was a circumstance when he left China in 1932. And because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were many creative ways, ingenious ways to come to America. And because my grandfather had difficulty to get him over, he had to have a scheme called the paper son, paper father arrangement, where this gentleman, actually our uncle, became his paper father to bring him over to America in 1932. Chong Hong Hong. That was his paper father to make the claim that he was an American-born Chinese, that he can bring his son from America, from China. So he arrived, or he left. He left from Point Hong Kong in 1932. And this is what it looked like in 1932. And he left on a Canadian Pacific line, the Empress of Asia, across Hong Kong to Shanghai to Japan, across to Vancouver in 1932. And imagine a young boy living in a village and facing this traumatic trip to come to Go Mountain. And he arrived on April 30th, 1932, after taking a railroad train ride across Canada through the Canadian Pacific Railroad, and arrived on April 20th, 1932 at the port of Boston. And he had to go through the immigration station at the East Boston location to go through and get processed. And of course, he had to prove, hey, I am the son of this paper father, or my father. And he had to vouch that he knows everything about the village, how many houses is his uncle live, how many steps is his school, how many leagues is it to the market. This is a certificate of identity. He had to carry it forever to prove he can live and work in America. This is the certificate of identity he had to carry all the time on Go Mountain. So he arrived to Central Square in Cambridge in 1932 and stayed there for 4 years with my grandfather, Moi Chung. And he stayed here at the Imperial Restaurant at the Central Square, at 2 Central Square. From there, he went to Los Angeles from 1936 to 1943 near Los Angeles City Hall. And this was where he developed his English skills, his confidence, adapting to American society. He attended all the requisite public schools. In particular, he went to Belmont High School in Los Angeles. And at that time was virtually an all-American white high school. And the picture to your left is the Chinese Club of Belmont High School in 1937. To the right is his picture when he graduated from Belmont High School, roughly in 1940. From there, he decided, because of World War II and the circumstances at that time, he decided to become an aircraft mechanic at Curtis Wright Technical Institute in Glendale. And he got his aircraft mechanic certificate from the Department of Commerce through the Aeronautical Branch in 1943 at that time. So from there, and this is the course during World War II, during the Sino-Japanese War. And what happened in 1943 was the Magnuson Act. The Magnuson Act, that was the act that symbolically Congress ended the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. However, it only allowed, after that, 1943, only 105 Chinese to immigrate per year. That was the only allowance. Imagine 105 Chinese were only allowed to immigrate to America after 1943 per year. That was the Magnuson Act of 1943. So when my father left Glendale in 1943, this was the prime, the heyday of San Francisco Chinatown. It was a place, a happening place, because of World War II, a lot of activity with the Army, the Navy, the Marines. But it was a golden age of tourism, things of that nature in 1943. And this is what the glory days of San Francisco Chinatown looked like on Grand Avenue. You had nightclubs, you had Chop Suey restaurants. It was a place to live, to work, to enjoy life. So my father joined the Navy and became part of what we call the Naval Reserve in 1943, served 2 years, and he worked for Pan American Airways with the seaplanes on Treasure Island between San Francisco and Oakland. And to your right, upper right, is the picture of the all Chinese crew that were segregated. There were no mixed races of crew. They were segregated. So my father was part of this all Chinese crew. And this picture was taken in 1943. And in front of the iconic China Clipper, the seaplane of that era. So he was an aircraft mechanic in uniform, very stylish. To the left on his leather jacket, he was getting more confident, being more Americanized, the American way. Eventually, he went to Honolulu in 1944 and was part of the service at the Honolulu Air Station to serve the seaplanes. And this was in 1944. And because of that, his service, sooner or later, he will be duly recognized as a Chinese American veteran of World War II among the other 20,000 Chinese American veterans who served proudly during World War II, the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Merchant Marine, the Coast Guard, so forth. From 1946 to 1950, my father did a different venture. He decided to seek an opportunity to be part of the era, the golden era of the Chinese nightclubs at the Kubakan Theater Restaurant, at the gateway of Chinatown, at Grant and Bush, at 414 Grand Avenue from 1946 to 1950. And this is what it looked like to your right, the Kubakan Theater Restaurant in 1943. And what is that? A nightclub in Chinatown? I never heard about that. Well, again, repeat, it was the golden age of the Chinese nightclub. It was a place where it was started by the Forbidden City by Charlie Lowe back in the late 30s. And there were many copycats, many nightclubs to replicate what Forbidden City was, its success at that time, from the late 30s to the early 50s. And Kubakan Theater Restaurant was owned by a gentleman by the name of Eddie Pan, a native from Macau, very creative entrepreneur, a wonderful promoter. He was the majority partner of the Kubakan Theater Restaurant. And this was the menu of that era that had both Chop Suey in American dishes. And to the left, was to cater to the American palate, where there's beef with hard liquor. To the right, Chop Suey, all the dishes. For $2.50 from at that time in 1943, you can have a lavish, fantastic dinner. And this was, again, the part of the golden age of the China nightclub. 3 times a night, there were programs of different activities. Of course, you would be, whether you're an American white or a native Chinese, you go there for the food. Chop Suey. Chop Suey, the favorite cuisine for the Chinese up to 1965. Chop Suey. And as part of programming, you had dancing. And Eddie Pond focused on Latino music. That was the theme to be set out against other competitions, other nightclubs. That was the music, that dancing music, the Latino sound of the 40s. And there was a program, a theme, 3 times a night, called A Night in Chinatown. A great place for dining, drinking, dancing, but also a lavish creative program, A Night in Chinatown. And what you had was a lot of singing, a lot of dancing, magic acts, comedy routines, and stripping. And this was the era where it was lively, very exotic. Americans were accepting Chinese, and Chinese were trying to be very more organized. This was the kind of the world of magic for the Chinese Americans in the 1940s. It was a ticket to be part of America. And these performances, lavish dancing, silk costumes, fantastic acts, and again, you see a picture of Eddie Pond. He was a great promoter, and you can see the audience, attentive audience, enjoying the different dancing of the program in the 1940s. And my father, he was a partner with that. He was serving dinners, serving at the bar, and to me, that was the highlight of his life, being a partner at the Kublai Theater restaurant. And at that point, in my mind, he became a true gentleman. He knew how to be well-groomed, how to dress, how to have that confident swagger of being an American Chinese in the 1940s. In my mind, that was his highlight, the pinnacle of his life in America, in Gim Suey. This was part of his American dream. But then the era of the nightclub slowly died. He went to New Chinatown on Broadway and Hill Street near downtown Los Angeles. He was there from 1950 to 1955. And this is a picture of the East Gate, the gateway to New Chinatown, Los Angeles, to Central Plaza. And this New Chinatown in particular had a Hollywood theme, and because of this image of this Chinatown, it was the inspiration of Walt Disneyland later in the 50s. So this is where he lived in Los Angeles from 1950 to 1955. Because of his skills, he became an aircraft mechanic for Lockheed in Burbank, building mostly military aircraft. This is an anti-submarine warfare aircraft from 1950 to 1979 in Burbank, in California. Long career. He was an inspector for Lockheed at that time. But on the weekends, he was associated with a place called the Far East Cafe in Little Tokyo, serving, guess what? Chop Suey from 1950 to 1974. So from Monday to Friday, he would work for Lockheed. From Saturday to Sunday, he would be a waiter at the Far East Cafe from 1950 to 1974, serving fantastic chop suey. China Mishi. And China Mishi is the Japanese version of Chop Suey. For the Japanese palate, they prefer the dishes to be more pleasing to look at versus the taste. So it's called China Mishi, a Japanese version of Chop Suey. And that's Chop Suey, what you see right there. And this is the menu of Chop Suey. You can see little dishes for $1, 55 cents, 40 cents, 1 ton, about 1 ton for 50 cents. A big box of chow mein for 60 cents. So this is the pricing of Chop Suey at that time. So eventually, my father had a calling through a matchmaker to get married to my mother, Sin Hoi Tang, from Santa Barbara. And they got married on January 14th, 1955. And subsequently, my father bought a house with my mother in that same year, 1955. And eventually, a year later, after that marriage, number one son, me, I showed up at that time. And a year later, was number two son, my brother, Michael George Chong. So there were I would say, proud moments, I think, of having us, the two boys, myself and my brother Michael. And in a special moment, we were both delivered, my brother and myself, by Dr. Julius Su, the godfather of Los Angeles Chinatown, at the old French hospital on Hill Street, where he delivered thousands of the Su babies from the 50s and 60s and 70s. I was one of the Su babies that he delivered at the old French hospital. So Dr. Julius Su, the godfather of Los Angeles Chinatown. Also, from 1943 to 1945, he was in the 14th Air Force in China. He was a medical doctor for the Flying Tigers during that time. The Flying Tiger from 1943 to 1945. And this is a picture of family life. It was a tradition to take pictures in front of our house. That was the norm, to take picture in front of your house in the 50s and 60s. And that's us, our family, with my grandfather, Moi Chung. And we were closely associated with Los Angeles Chinatown. You see, this is a picture of Central Plaza. And you see the Phoenix Bakery, Hong Kong Lo. And this is the Oriental architecture you see in the new Chinatown of that era. But the background, there's always, again, the fear of the Chinese. Of course, after the takeover of the communists of China, there was a Red Scare. China, unless you were Taiwan, were the enemy of the American, especially the course of the Korean War. So what happened? Again, the Chinese were being persecuted, and there was the era of McCarthyism, of being communist, being commie, being red. Red China was a threat to America, and there was that infamous program where Chinese Americans were encouraged to confess in order to get what we call a visa or a green card. So that was a climate of fear from 1956 to 1965, where you were forced to confess that you were a paper son, paper father, who were your relatives. That was that era. A continuation, the persecution of the Chinese in 1950s and 60s. Eventually, there was the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 by Lyndon Baines Johnson. And in the era of the 60s, there were many landmark laws or acts that were passed. This was one of the many that were achieved and enacted by Congress. But the most important one that affects us Chinese in particular was the one signed by Lyndon Baines Johnson. It was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, where all the we call it the numerical barriers against Chinese were lifted among the other Asians. This was the turning point for us Chinese to immigrate to Gold Mountain, America in 1965. In the course of our life in America, we took our vacations when my father had time, which was rare. Our quiet man, Gim Suey Chong. But his American dream was for his sons, my brother and myself, to graduate from college, my brother from the California Institute of Technology, myself to graduate from the University of Southern California. That was the reason for him to live for us, to achieve that American dream. And this is the very picture of him before he died in 1979, some 42 years ago. And this is a poem I wrote for my father, thinking about his sacrifice, his struggle to be in Gold Mountain, to achieve the American dream. He was our quiet man. But this is my poem to him. And I say, Father, I love you. When I was a child, I never loved my father, nor I hated him as a son. For our talks were crisp, our times were lean. At the city of angels, he meekly toiled away, and his words were stiff, and his thoughts were dark, but he kept our family together. After a subliminal journey of my ancestors' roots, I finally grasped his awesome life as a paper son from Kaiping to Gum. I finally mused about him, a hard pursuer of his dream, a devoted husband to his wife, a doting father for his two sons, our quiet man of quiet dignity. Why a frosty moon crests down the celestial sky, midst a surreal brood, in heartfelt affection, I say, Father, I love you. This is my poetic tribute to my father, Gim Suey Chong, our quiet man. Generation 6, me, Raymond Douglas Chong, Zhang Weiming. And this is our family. We're very lucky. We're blessed with many vintage pictures, black and white, of our family. And again, this is the picture of the family. Both on my father's side, the Chongs on the left, and the Tongs, my mother's side, all the Yus. And again, you see, we're always in front of the house back in the 60s. It was a tradition. But we also had our vacations, our trips to our relatives in San Francisco to the left and to Santa Barbara to the right. And to me, growing up as a kid, I always cherished seeing my grandparents, whether in Santa Barbara, whether in San Francisco. It was such a joyful occasion. And also to play with my cousins and my aunts and uncles. Those were the cherished moments I can always remember. And going back to Los Angeles Chinatown, when I was growing up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, Hong Kong Lo was our favorite joint to eat. What else? Chop Suey. To the right, to get the sweets, was Phoenix Bakery, whether it's going to be a almond cookies, strawberry pie. Those were our culinary delights when I was growing up as a child of Chinatown in Los Angeles. But the dark side of my life of America was the riots in 1965. And that was a time of unrest, of discrimination among the African Americans. The police were very brutal, and it created an atmosphere that led to the Watts riots. It was 6 days of sheer chaos near USC in South Central Los Angeles, where 35 people died. I remember those moments when I was a little boy. And still growing up, 1968, up to 2020, 1968 was a pivotal moment in America, where it was the height of the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive during the Spring Festival around February 1968, the protests across the American cities, the Civil Rights Movement, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy in June 1968 at the Ambassador Hotel. And I remember that moment, that Wednesday morning, when I read the headlines of Bobby, RFK, being assassinated. And that was a cold, chilly morning, I remember, on June 1968. And this is, in my mind, up to 2020 was a turning point of American history, including civil rights. And near my neighborhood where I live, there was the walkout at 68, near my neighborhood, where we had protest walkouts by Latinos. The Latinos, the Hispanics, the Chicano, the Mexicans were discriminated severely. They could not speak Spanish. They were taught to be, you could all be good as a janitor or laborer. They were fully discriminated, so they walked out of their high schools in 1968, called walkout, protest. Looking years later, Vincent Chin murder, June 19, 1982. Vincent Chin was at his bachelor party, hit at a bar, at a strip club. He encountered two white auto workers. They had an argument, a little pushing and shoving. Vincent left the bachelor party. The two white gentlemen came after him. They pursued him, caught up with him. One of them had a baseball bat and hit him repeatedly and killed him. And his mother, Lily Chin, grieved for him. Those two murderers were charged for manslaughter. What they got was 3 years for probation and a $3,000 fine. For murder, that was the consequence of that crime. Fast forward to 1962, Los Angeles, across the whole region, not just in the Watts. It was 7 days of unrest because of the Rodney King verdict, where there are some police officers were not guilty of the maltreatment of Rodney King. And that was where 63 people died. And this is where the Korean American community was devastated. This is 7 days of civil unrest in 1992, where I live in Los Angeles at that time. And this is my neighborhood where I live in the Elysian Valley, in a place called Frogtown, near the Los Angeles River. This is my neighborhood, my barrio. This is what it looked like my growing years as a kid. Moving forward to my life, I went to the public schools, Doris Place, elementary school, Irving Junior High School, near my home. Went to Marshall High School, where you may recognize where many Hollywood films are made at Hollywood High School. I mean, from Hollywood, and many famous scenes is where I graduated. And then eventually I graduated from University of Southern California in 1977. And it was a great moment for my father to achieve that American dream for him. And my credentials, I'll skip that for now. Time is getting short. My degrees, I'll skip that part. But I'm also a specially appointed professor at Shandong Jintong University. And this is part of my narrative, living in America. And this is my life, pursuing the American dream. I'm being involved with the International Chinese Transportation Professional Association for 2 years, the founder and president. But I also have my creative side. I was the inaugural chair of the Miss Oakland China pageant in 1988. And that was when I got involved more so in the community in Oakland Chinatown, more so in the Chinese community in particular, more so with the Asian community at large in 1988. Became president of the Wasong Service Club, a permanent community service club in Oakland Chinatown at that time. And then I had my own nonprofit organization called Oakland Asian Student Educational Service, similar to BRI, where we had tutoring, mentoring, training for kids. And this was in the heart of Chinatown, where we serve Chinese and Southeast Asian kids with tutors from UC Berkeley. But a wonderful moment was having Kinji Kao Chong, my #1 son, my only son, born in 1998. Later on, I got involved with another group for 2 years. But this was a turning point for me, was the suicide of John Thomas Killip on January 30th, 2003, 18 years ago. Before that date, before his suicide, I was pursuing the American dream in a way, but it was a turning point at that moment when I went back, looking back into my roots, both in America, Guam Mountain, to China, to Kaiping. That was a turning point of my life. And I returned on November 21st, 2007, as a fallen leaf to represent my father, to reunite with my relatives in Yunnan in 2007 as a fallen leaf. And meeting my new relatives along the way, the second family, that was the day when I first met my other relatives that I had never known about. And to the right was an old steel rusty box that was kept hidden for 58 years. And I found new treasures, a little slice of my father's life in San Francisco from 1943 to 1950. And this is the day when I had my Jiangmen on May 8, 2009. And this is in Yulongong, the village Dragon Hill, at the tombs, at the Fan Sum, the hill of the Flying Swan, where we honor my ancestors. And there are the tombs of my great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, and great-great-grandfather. They're buried there, Chun Yun Chung, Bein Yiu Chung, Lun Chung. And because of that turning point, I became a writer, a poet, lyricist, my own band, writer of books, filmmaker, my Odyssey Between Two Worlds, journalist for Asian American news about things of importance for the Asian American community, and my website on Chinese love poetry. But I'm looking forward, continuing the American dream, Generation 7, Kinji Kao Chong, my #1 son, who graduated recently last year from the University of Texas at Austin in cinema to pursue the career as a filmmaker. And his company, KKC Visuals, he is pursuing his American dream, filming actively right now in Hollywood, across America. Very active, very productive, very imaginative son, even though I'm a little biased, I could say. But he is the media director for a rising pop singer named Kishe. And sometime next year, there will be a world tour of his band, Kishe, across America and Canada and into Asia. And he has his own videos on YouTube, maybe up to 2 million hits. So my son is pursuing his American dream. But now, looking fast forward to now, 2021. Hey, there's anti-Asian hate. The China flu, the Kung flu. But what I just have shown to you of the course of the Chinese experience in America It's always been like this since the day of the first arrival on a ship at a seaport in America, whether in Boston or New York. There's always been anti-Asian hate in some shape or form. But we are Americans. We belong here. We do. I am not your scapegoat. I am not your scapegoat. We are all Americans. And sadly, a good friend, the legendary Corky Lee, the undisputed, unofficial Asian American photographer laureate, who dedicated his career, 50 years of his life, to tell the Chinese, the Asian American experience through photos, one at a time. That was his American dream, to share the Chinese experience. Showing the photographic justice of what he saw in America from New York City and beyond. So that concludes my presentation in a nutshell, but I'm still pursuing my American dream. My son is pursuing his American dream. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Raymond. What a journey from so far ago to now. And I see your handsome son is doing very well, pursuing his American dream. And thank you for mentioning Corky Lee. You mentioned that he took the 150-year the railroad ceremony. And in that picture, I also saw another very famous Chinese American judge, Michael Kwong.
Yes, he died last year.
Yeah, he died last year, and Corky Lee passed away early this year. Yeah. Okay, so now is a Q&A time from the audience. If you have any questions, you can either put it in your chat window, or you can use the Zoom raise hand. We can unmute you and you can ask questions directly.
I saw some questions.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, could you read it? Yeah, from Globe.
Where is it?
From the chat. Yeah.
Is it the ones that soon Chinese Americans on guns and show up more?
Yeah,
often?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's a delicate question, whether to have guns or not. It's one of our so-called rights to possess guns. Personally, myself, I don't believe in guns. I don't believe in violence. As you may notice in American media, violence is the norm. And you can see the course of our history, the massacres are the norm. So I'm saddened by that, but we do need to protect ourselves in some way or fashion. I'm not going to say I'm for guns or against guns, but I just abhor violence, period.
I have a question.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Can I say, okay, I have a question. Raymond, how do you relate yesterday's killing of 8 men, including 6 Asian people, Asian women, to our history, to the history of Chinese Americans? Do you see a pattern of violence toward us?
Well, as I shown previously in the 19th century, there were massacres, Chinese, and now we have new massacres. So it's continuing the said legacy of hatred in the form of violence. And it's unfortunate it happened yesterday in Atlanta, that massacre. Well, I'm not unsure whether it's racial or madness, whatever it is. The bottom line, it was a massacre. And it's the unfortunate American tradition, you can say, to have massacres. And to me, that's unacceptable, period.
Thank you.
Okay. And the other question is, how did you find out all the details of your family history?
Which history? Back to
your family history. Yeah, how did you find out all the details? I see maybe these young kids, they are asking, how do you do that?
How did I do that? Well, this is an amazing part. Before January 30th, 2003, I was very whitewashed. I always knew about the American version of history. As I mentioned, to hate Red China. My father, my grandfather had some dark secrets. They could not tell because they were paper sons, paper fathers, whatever. So I had to, from January 30th, 2003 forward, after they had died in the 70s, bit by bit, gather a story from nothing, from a blank canvas to a colorful story that goes back to 1506 AD. And it required tremendous patience. I'm like a genealogy detective, CIS version of that. So it took a lot of creativity, a lot of craziness on part of what my mother would think I am, to go back far into the village, to go to the history of my village since 1506. I have all the history of my village, the typhoons, the starvation, the famines, the wars. I got all that snapshot of my village. The oral stories from my elders, my seniors, from the Chinese immigration files. It took me a long time to create a canvas, a tapestry to tell you my family story here in America.
Yeah, so a question from the audience from Xiang Ling. He said, Raymond, thank you for sharing. Question, is there any consequences after confessing from being a paper son or paper parent or something like that?
Back then, to be confessed as a paper father or a paper son, you were at high risk of being deported easily. There was a deal back in the confession program. If you admit that you're a paper son, we give you a visa, but you have to confess, reveal who are the other paper son, paper father, and they may be at risk to being deported. So it's real. You could be deported.
Okay, so then the confessing program so allows you to stay if you confess for
it was an evil deal.
It would be a deal, yeah.
You had to confess or to admit, and that created a lot of tension among the families, who was what, and it caused a lot of family breakups too. Of course, the American officials didn't care about that part. They just want to kick out the evil Chinese, the communists.
I see. So the follow-up question is, did your father confess?
I never knew about his story.
Oh, okay.
He died, his secret hidden. He died on December 2nd, 1979. And he never talked, zero, never. It was after January 30th, 2003, I got through the Chinese immigration file, talking to my elders. That was when I found the truth of his journey in Gold Mountain as a paper son.
I see.
Raymond, I have a question. Okay, what's your suggestion to first, because I'm the first generation in the United States. So what's your suggestion to the first and the second generation in the United States to save some documents or some story for the history story? Because you have 6 generation story, but for us, we only have 2 generation. How do we keep all the documents? Do you think it's necessary we keep all the documents for the Chinese American history for the future?
To now, in the past, the papers that you're referring to among the laundryman, the restaurant man, the businessman, they thought it was trash, junk, burn up. But to me, these are treasures. These are artifacts. These are archives. They're worth preserving, protecting. It tells, in a physical sense, we are here. We live here. We work here. We struggle here. It's real. It's not somebody's imagination. It's evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, and as one audience, Alex James said, like maybe later in the future, our great-grandson or someone will tell our story. So we need to actually preserve this history of our Chinese American immigration histories.
Well, a key point for us now, since we're aware of it, we have awesome tools, multimedia, whether it's video, photography, filming. Do it now for your elders to capture not just the American experience, but the Chinese experience. Because I know in China, it has its own history too, to be told. Whether it's a Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, things of that nature.
Yep.
Yeah, I think one person I really like to read. He said, "Thank you. The point is, when our great-grandson told our story, they are proud to tell." I think really, really great. We should proud to tell this history.
I hope my son would do that well.
And I have a question. Okay, for example, for the parents who look like us, we always suggest our kids to learn Chinese, no matter it's the Mandarin or Cantonese, and we try to let the kids know their roots. So does your parents asking you to learn any Chinese or learn the Chinese history when you was young?
Two stories. One, because of the Red Scare, we had to be Americanized quickly, to be American, to act American, speak American. So I was, from my parents' perspective, encouraged strongly to speak American English as quickly as possible, be adaptive. And the other side of the coin, I did attend Chinese school, and it went over my head at that time. And I do honestly regret that, missing that Chinese language school, because I do love to talk or speak, hopefully someday, in Putonghua or Guangdonghua fluently, someday.
Because we have some young students there in the high school. Do you have any suggestion to the young generation
about being an American or speaking Chinese or being Americanized? Which suggestion are you suggesting?
Definitely, they are Chinese American. How can they be a good Chinese American people in the United States?
Well, one thing is to follow your American dream as is. Whether there's roadblocks, there's obstacles, that is life. You have to overcome it, whether it's a struggle or sacrifice. Pursue that American dream forward, but also looking back to the homeland, our ancestral homeland, China. Appreciate the roots of our China, the 5,000 years of history, the struggles and sacrifices of our ancestors, our forefathers, of the lives that they have given for us to get to here, to this very stage. Because I know the 100 years of the humiliation was torturous for all Chinese, whether in the North or South. Those were the desperate days. And we should not forget about that at all, period.
Thank you.
Yeah, one question. What inspired you to share your ancestors and your own American dream in this webinar?
The inspiration was slowly created when John Thomas Killip committed that suicide. It's been a growing period. I developed it. And the more I got into my journey in looking to my roots, I have a passion, a fire to share that story, not just for my own family or not just among the Chinese. I want to share it to all Americans, because when you think about all Americans, whether you're Black, white, Hispanic, you come from somewhere else, a different part. Your story may have a different variation, different shape or form, but we have a common thread of pursuing the American dream. And another one is because of Corky Lee. He is my inspiration to perpetuate his legacy, because I interviewed him, I talked with him, I got to know him. This was his American dream, photographic justice for all Asian Americans. So I'm impassioned to do that. And we have our own story to tell.
Yeah.
Li Lee, and she asked, what is the most treasurable Chinese tradition you still practice today?
Dim sum.
Not the
Chop Suey.
Yim cha. I like dim sum.
Yeah.
That is my Cantonese fix. I have dim sum every day for lunch, practically.
Yeah.
So it reminds me of my culinary roots in Cantonese way.
Okay, any other questions? Do we have like young generation, the new generation audience in our audience? If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
I saw one question. Okay, after 5 generations, do you feel you fit in to the American culture and enough complete?
What do you appreciate the most? Yeah, that's.
Looking back of my family history and looking forward, I fit in most part, but I still have my roots tied back to China, to my relatives, my clan in Yulong. So I have one foot planted in America, but my other foot is planted in China. So I'm proud to say I am pursuing my American dream, but I'm also pursuing my China dream.
Wow, that's great.
Good answer.
Great answer, yeah. One question. Do you have very close non-Chinese American friends? Wow.
Of course, of course.
Of course. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, very close non-Chinese American. Oh, yes, I do. Where I work, where I live, wherever I am in my career, it's always been a dominant American white environment. And typically where I work, I'm the only person of color, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Or
the rare token Chinese or Asian. That's the norm. I don't think about it. Here I am, being Americanized in my way. I'm being courteous, respectful to them, but not having it as a mental block for me to pursue my American dream. But I'm cognizant of the tension right now in terms of the social equity, racial discrimination. I'm very cognizant of it, but I can disarm people with my smile.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's very powerful. So you visited your hometown, Kaiping, right? Longgang.
Yes.
So so what's your impression of your hometown? Any anything you want to share?
Yes, I remember the first moment going to the countryside in Kaiping, and just being dazzled by the beauty, the simplicity of the countryside, the rice fields, the fish ponds, the ducks, the pigs, and arriving to that village along the hills and mountains and looking back at the Dai-Lo, the castle in the sky. And in my mind, that is paradise.
Wow. Wow. Awesome. One question is they want to know more about your grandmother who later joined your grandfather. Any stories after that?
Maybe next time. Okay, next time.
I can give you a little short version.
Sure.
Because as I read through the Chinese immigration file, I discovered, oops, my grandfather, he had number 2 wife. He left a number 1 wife, and I discovered my grandma was a number 2 wife. Oh. I was totally stunned.
But back to that age, yeah. Something.
I always thought, hey, it's a grandma, but I didn't know she was the other woman.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Well, now it's 8:42. Maybe last question. So which part of Chinese tradition is worthwhile to inherit for better competency for Chinese Americans here, in your opinion?
In my simple, humble opinion as a ABC banana is to know your Chinese roots, where there's history, culture, cuisine, have that sense of being proud that you're Chinese here in America while pursuing your American dream. That is my advice moving forward as being Chinese here in America on Gold Mountain.
Wow, great. Thank you very much, Raymond. Yeah.
不客气。
谢谢你，谢谢你。Okay.
Yeah, and thank you for you spending time to share your story, your family story, and really we were really thankful, very much appreciated. And thank you all for attending our seminars, our audience. And this seminar will be recorded. We'll put in our YouTube channel. As one audience suggested, we should post it in the YouTube to let more people to learn from this great history.